A man who could buy anything in the world disguised himself as a beggar to find the one thing he couldn't own, a moment of truth. He walked into his own multi-million-dollar restaurant, a king dressed in rags, expecting only to be judged and dismissed. He was simply testing the hearts of the people in his kingdom. But by the end of the night, he would be handed a secret 7-word note from a terrified waiter. A note that would prove to be more valuable than his entire fortune, because it was a cry for help from the center of a monstrous crime, a crime so dark it was happening in plain sight, and he was the only one who could stop it. This is the story of what happens when the most powerful man in the room is the one that nobody sees. In the gilded cages of the ultra-wealthy, where every surface gleams and every interaction is polished, true connection is the rarest of all luxuries. For every wall built of marble and gold, another, thicker wall is built around the heart. This is the story of a man who owned the world but felt he had lost himself within its vast, empty corridors. A king who would trade his crown for rags, not in a search for more power or more riches, but for something infinitely more valuable, a single, honest moment. He was about to find that moment in the most unexpected of places, and in doing so, uncover a darkness that festered just beneath the glittering surface of his own meticulously crafted kingdom. His name was Elias Vance, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in boardrooms across the globe. As the CEO of the Vance Hospitality Group, his empire was built on an uncompromising standard of perfection. His hotels were sanctuaries of silent, seamless service. His restaurants were temples of high gastronomy. He curated flawless experiences for the global elite, yet his own life was a curated, empty performance. From his penthouse that pierced the clouds, he would look down upon the city he owned a piece of, and feel like a stranger. The endless parade of people who wanted something from him, who offered tailored smiles and rehearsed handshakes, had become a blur. They didn't see a man, they saw a vault, a symbol, a signature on a check. And he felt as though he were trapped inside. To escape this suffocating reality, he had a ritual, a desperate pilgrimage away from himself. On nights like these, he would shed the skin of Elias Vance, the titan of industry, and become nobody. In a small, anonymous apartment he kept for this very purpose, the expensive suit would be replaced by a threadbare coat, the polished Italian leather shoes swapped for scuffed, worn-out boots. A perfectly styled haircut would vanish under a grimy beanie. The man who stared back at him from a small, cracked mirror was a ghost, a man seemingly beaten down by life, invisible to the very world that fawned over his true identity. Tonight, he didn't want the best table. He didn't want the fawning service. He just wanted to see what his world truly looked like when the owner wasn't watching. His destination was the crown jewel of his empire, a restaurant whose name was a byword for opulence, the Serafina. It was a place where a single meal could cost more than most people make in a month. He had built it, he owned every crystal glass and silver fork, and tonight, he would enter it as a phantom. As he shuffled through the grand entrance, the immaculately dressed hostess looked him up and down, her expression a mask of barely concealed disgust. When he quietly asked for a table for one, she informed him they were fully booked, suggesting with a condescending sweetness that he might be more comfortable at one of the city's diners. This was the first test, and it always played out the same. The immediate judgment, the assumption that his appearance dictated his worth. Elias simply met her gaze, a steady and unwavering look from a man used to getting what he wanted, and quietly insisted she find something. With a dramatic sigh, she relented, leading him through the stunning dining room, past laughing couples and powerful executives, to a small wobbly table tucked away in a dark corner next to the noisy, swinging kitchen door. It was a table reserved for inconveniences. From his shadowed corner, Elias had a perfect view of the entire restaurant, a theater of wealth and performance. And from this vantage point, he watched the lead actor, the manager, Julian Thorne. Julian was a man who oozed a slick, predatory charm, a perfect chameleon of the service industry. Elias watched him bow and scrape before a wealthy couple, laughing a little too loudly at the man's vapid joke. A moment later, a young busboy accidentally dropped a fork with a clatter. Julian's charming smile vanished as if it had never existed. His face became a mask of cold fury as he grabbed the boy by the arm, his fingers digging in, hissing a venomous, unheard reprimand that made the boy flinch. He was a sycophant to the rich and a tyrant to the weak. Elias recognized it immediately. This was the rot, the kind of subtle poison that grows in the dark when no one is watching. Then, a young waiter approached Elias's table. His name tag read Leo. His uniform was neat but slightly frayed at the cuffs, and dark circles were etched under his eyes, but he moved with a precision and dignity that seemed entirely out of place. He didn't recoil from Elias's disheveled appearance. Instead, he carefully placed a napkin and a glass of water on the wobbly table. Then, in a small, almost imperceptible act of kindness, he slipped a folded coaster under one of the legs, steadying it. "Good evening, sir," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Welcome to the Serafina." "Sir." He had called him sir. He had fixed the table. He wasn't looking at the worn-out clothes. He was simply seeing a person. For the first time all night, Elias felt a flicker of something other than cynicism. This young man was different. He possessed a quiet grace that was a stark contrast to the practiced cruelty and fake smiles surrounding them. Elias decided, right then, to put him to the test. A real test. When Leo returned to take the order, Elias spoke in his raspy, quiet voice, ordering the pan-seared scallops, the wagyu steak, and then, the final, impossible piece, a bottle of the 1982 Chateau Margaux. Leo's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He knew the wine list. He knew that bottle cost over $10,000. He glanced at Elias's tattered coat, then back at his eyes, searching for the punchline, for the sign that this was some kind of cruel joke. He hesitated, noting that it was a very significant vintage. Elias simply confirmed that he was aware. The tension was palpable. Across the room, Julian Thorne had noticed the interaction and began to stride over, his face darkening with anger. This was the moment of truth. Would Leo laugh? Would he call for security? Would he refuse the order? After a second that stretched into an eternity, Leo gave a small, professional nod. He didn't question, he didn't judge. "Of course, sir," he said. "I'll put that in for you right away." But just as he turned, Julian arrived, grabbing his shoulder. "What do you think you're doing?" Julian hissed, his voice low and furious. "This thing can't afford a glass of tap water. Get him out of here." Leo stood his ground, his voice quiet but firm. "He is a guest, Mr. Thorne. My job is to serve the guest." Julian's eyes narrowed. "Your job is to do what I tell you. One more word, and you're finished. And you know what else I can finish." A flash of pure, unadulterated fear crossed Leo's face at the veiled threat, but he simply clenched his jaw and walked away to process the order. The test had been passed. In the face of his superior's fury and a direct, personal threat, the young waiter had chosen dignity. He had chosen kindness. The meal proceeded in silence, the outrageously expensive wine presented and served with the same quiet professionalism Leo offered every other guest. Finally, as the meal ended, Leo came to clear the table. As he picked up the final plate, his hand brushed against Elias's. It was a lightning-fast, almost invisible movement, but in that fleeting contact, his fingers deftly left a small, folded piece of paper under the edge of the saucer. He made eye contact with Elias for a fraction of a second, and his eyes were filled not with kindness, but with sheer terror. Elias's heart suddenly began to pound. He waited until Leo was gone, then slowly, with hands that were now trembling slightly, he picked up the folded note. Beneath the table, he unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, scrawled on a piece of order paper. It read, "They're poisoning the food. He's watching me. Help." The cynicism vanished. The loneliness was replaced by a cold, terrifying focus. The ambient sounds of the restaurant faded into a low, ominous hum. The king in disguise had come looking for honesty. He had just found a cry for help from the heart of a conspiracy that threatened to burn his entire empire to the ground. The ghost was gone. The king was back. Elias threw a wad of cash on the table, more than enough to cover the extravagant meal, and walked out of the Serafina. He moved not with the shuffling gait of a beaten man, but with a renewed, predatory purpose. Once outside in the cool night air, he pulled out a sleek, encrypted smartphone and dialed a single number. His voice was no longer raspy, but sharp and commanding. "Anya," he said, "we have a problem. A big one. Get to the safe house. Bring Silas. Now." The passive observer had become an active hunter. The game had changed. Elias Vance was no longer testing the character of his employees. He was preparing for war. But the hero of this story wasn't the billionaire. It was the waiter, trapped in an impossible situation. Leo Moreno's life was a daily battle against mounting despair. His younger sister, Maya, was his entire world, and she was fading away in a hospital bed, her only hope a kidney transplant with a staggering cost and an even more staggering waiting list. Julian Thorne knew this. He had discovered Leo's vulnerability and used it as a leash, wrapping it tighter around his neck with every passing day. The note wasn't just a cry for help, it was an act of impossible courage, a final, desperate gamble from a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Within the hour, Elias was in his high-tech command center, hidden within the modest apartment. With him were Anya Sharma, his sharp and athletic head of security, and Silas, a young, hoodie-clad cybersecurity prodigy. Elias laid out his theory. Julian was switching the restaurant's high-end food supplies with cheap, expired, or contaminated ingredients, pocketing the massive difference. The risk was astronomical. A citywide food poisoning outbreak traced back to the Serafina would be the end of the company. Silas determined that Julian's office computer was on an air-gapped system, meaning he would have to physically break in to access the proof. Despite Anya's protests, Elias insisted on going with them. That young man, Leo, had put his life in his hands. He would not sit back while others took the risk. That night, they moved like shadows through the opulent restaurant, now rendered eerie and alien in the dark. Anya, a ghost in black tactical gear, expertly disabled security cameras and bypassed electronic locks. They slipped through the silent, cavernous kitchen and up a back staircase, arriving at Julian's office. The door was protected by a high-end biometric fingerprint scanner. For Silas, it was child's play. He dusted the scanner to reveal a latent print, photographed it, and used a portable 3D printer to create a thin gelatinous film with the fingerprint's ridges. Pressing it to the scanner with his own finger, the lock flashed green and clicked open. Inside, Silas went to work on the computer, his fingers flying. He quickly bypassed the military-grade encryption, correctly guessing that the arrogant Julian would base his password on something personal, the acquisition date of his first vintage Rolex. As files began to decrypt, the true scale of the horror was revealed. It was so much worse than they had imagined. There was a secret ledger, showing payments to a shell corporation called Viridian Provisions, which Anya quickly linked to a known crime syndicate. Julian wasn't just cutting corners. He was laundering money for the cartel through the restaurant's supply chain. Then they found the shipping manifests. The descriptions were sickening: grade F poultry, chemically treated produce, not for human consumption. He had been knowingly buying industrial surplus and literal garbage, and his chefs were unknowingly serving it as gourmet cuisine. And he wasn't just poisoning the Serafina's clientele. He was using the Vance Hospitality distribution network to move the tainted goods to a dozen other high-end restaurants in the city. But the final file was the most damning. It was labeled Leo Moreno. Inside were copies of his sister Maya's medical records and a series of recorded audio files. Silas pressed play. Julian's smug, menacing voice filled the silent office, blackmailing Leo, threatening to use his influence to have Maya's name mysteriously disappear from the transplant list if Leo ever thought of becoming a hero. The recording ended, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence. Elias closed his eyes, a single muscle twitching in his jaw. The test, the note, Leo's quiet dignity under pressure, it all clicked into a horrifying, tragic picture. "Copy everything," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "We have what we need. The reckoning is coming." The next day, during the busy lunch rush, the Serafina buzzed with its usual energy. Julian Thorne was gliding through the dining room, a portrait of smug satisfaction, when the grand front doors swung open. A king does not sneak in through the service entrance twice. Elias Vance entered, but this was not the stooped, shabby man from the night before. This was the titan of industry, dressed in a flawlessly tailored suit, radiating an aura of immense power and cold, controlled fury. The entire restaurant fell silent. The hostess from the previous night froze, her face turning pale with sickening recognition. Julian's charming facade crumbled as he stammered a welcome. Elias ignored him, his eyes scanning the room. "Leo Moreno," he commanded. "Get him. And then meet me in your office. Now." Fear flashed in Julian's eyes. He knew he was trapped. Elias strode through the restaurant, his path parting like the Red Sea, and entered Julian's office without knocking, taking a seat behind the manager's own desk. When Julian scurried in, sweating and protesting his innocence, Elias held up a hand to silence him. "I had dinner here last night," he began, his voice dangerously calm. "At that small, wobbly table by the kitchen. The one you reserve for people you deem worthless. I learned 2 things. First, the service, from one particular waiter, was impeccable, full of dignity and grace. Second, the food was poison." Elias gestured to a tablet on the desk and systematically revealed everything. The Shell Corporation, the police raids that were happening at that very moment, the 12 other restaurants that were being investigated. When Julian blustered that it was his word against a disgruntled waiters, Elias simply played the audio file of him blackmailing Leo. Julian's own cruel threats echoed through his opulent office, and he collapsed into a chair, utterly defeated. At that moment, the door opened, and Leo stood there, terrified but resolute. Elias turned his gaze to him, his voice softening. "Leo," he said, "I received your note. You are safe now. I want you to look this man in the eye and tell me your story." And so he did. Leo's voice, shaking at first, grew stronger with every word as he recounted the discovery of the spoiled food, the blackmail, the constant threats against his dying sister. He spoke of the impossible choice he was forced to make every single day, to serve poison to strangers to protect his own blood. It was a powerful, damning testimony of a good man pushed to the absolute limit. As he finished, 2 uniformed police officers entered the office. "You built your little kingdom on the fear of good people," Elias said to Julian, his voice laced with contempt. "It's over." The reign of the corrupt gatekeeper was finished. Later, after Julian had been led away, Elias, Anya, and Leo stood alone in the office. Elias turned to Leo. "What you did," he said, "passing me that note, that was the single bravest act I have ever witnessed. You did the right thing. Now it's my turn." He handed Leo a tablet. On the screen was a bank transfer confirmation. The full, astronomical cost of his sister's medical care, her transplant, and her recovery had been paid in full by an anonymous donation. Furthermore, the best transplant specialist in the country was already on a plane, flying in to personally oversee her procedure. Tears streamed down Leo's face as he stared at the screen, the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders in one shuddering sob of pure relief. But Elias wasn't finished. An act of integrity like that, he explained, could not be repaid with just money. It had to be rewarded with trust. The company had a sickness, and Julian was merely a symptom. Elias had been too disconnected, too far removed. He needed someone on the inside, someone with an unbreakable moral compass. He was creating a new position, Director of Employee Welfare and Ethical Oversight for the entire Vance Hospitality Group. The director would report directly to him, acting as his eyes and ears, to protect the staff and ensure that what happened here could never happen again. "The job is yours," Elias said, a genuine warm smile appearing on his face for the very first time. "If you want it." Leo, stunned and speechless, simply nodded, a look of profound purpose dawning on his face. In a world of curated images and hollow words, one man's quiet courage had cut through the noise. Elias Vance went looking for a single moment of truth and found a new mission. Leo Moreno fought for his sister and, in doing so, saved countless others. It is a reminder that true power is not measured in dollars or skyscrapers, but in character. It is the courage to stand up when you are told to kneel, the integrity to do what is right when no one is watching, and the proof that sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one that speaks the loudest truth. One brave act, one cry for help in the dark, can be enough to change everything.